Getting into vintage IBM PS2s can be quite a challenge, but there is an exception. The model 3286 is somewhat easy to upgrade because it has regular ISA slots. I restored this IBM years ago on this channel. Today we're going to find out how upgradable this IBM is and try it out with a suitable DOS game. I'm currently using this IBM with this tiny 8513, so we're going to restore and upgrade to this 8515. The Dallas battery has gone flat in this machine, so we are going to build a modern replacement with some help from my favorite sponsor PCB. Most of my PS2s have a chunky red switch, but for some reason this machine has a white switch. It's a bit of a mystery to me why that is. I think this machine is currently running DOS 330, so we'll upgrade it with DOS 622. To get inside this machine, we only need to remove one screw on each side. Apparently I left a note to myself on the lid, and it says 1990, restored test OK, HDD needs recap. So apparently we seem to have a bad cap in the hard drive. Yes, my note seems to be correct. There are a few caps on the PCB for the hard drive. At least two of the pads look very dull. So two of these caps are actually leaking. And here's our bad Dallas. These can still be found used on eBay. But now we have modern replacements. Aside from those two minor issues, this machine looks pretty much perfect. Okay, let's start with a quick test. I can really see how tiny that display is compared to the keyboard. Well, the hard drive still spins up. Oh, what's going on here? We're not getting anything on the screen. Something is wrong. Maybe it requires that Dallas battery. Okay, Dallas battery back in. Let's try again. Yeah, now we can see the RAM check. We've got 1 meg of RAM on board. And the usual error codes. And hard drive is still working. Okay, so just two minor issues. Let's start with the display, because this display badly needs a wash. And I want to leave it to dry while we take care of the PS2. But first, a quick disclaimer. Please don't poke around inside CRT displays. They may contain high voltages, even when the cord unplugged. That being said, to get inside one of these, you need soft prying tools. And you need a special tool. I don't have the original IBM tool, so I made one myself. So basically just took regular PC slot cover and split it in half. This piece here has two tabs, and they have corresponding holes up here. So you basically need to push this tool down and release the clip by pushing firmly and then bending it. You could probably hear the clicky noise when the tab is released. I wish I had made two of these. That would have made the disassembly even easier. Unfortunately, this case is quite soft, so it's very easy to make marks. So if you're playing along, be careful and go slow. Okay, that was a bit tricky to get on camera, but here you can see those tabs. So my homemade tool went down this hole here and bent on these tabs. Okay, a pretty reasonable amount of soot. So this display has definitely seen some normal use. I bought this display years ago and I have never turned it on. I think it's a good practice to discharge it anyways. If nothing else, it's a good habit to always start by discharging the tube. Okay, let's see what this large shield will reveal. Well, that's not too bad. It's definitely used, but I have seen worse, a lot worse than this. Hopefully it's still good enough. The design looks very similar to the 8518, so let's pop that neckboard off and disconnect it from the main board. One red connector, one blue connector, And here's the green connector. Who would have guessed? Well, this connector here actually looks really cheap and fragile. So I think I'm gonna leave it on. I can wash both boards together. There are a few more connectors down here. And some of them are quite hard to reach. So I think we need to remove the main PCB first. The main PCB is stuck. And I think it's held in place with clips on the sides here. And yes, that was a good guess. Now it's free. So now I think we can remove the main PCB. No, this side is still stuck. IBM probably had a special tool for this. And now we can access the last connector back here. Well, not the easiest display to take apart, but I'd say that went okay. Just like my other PS2 displays. This display too has a Panasonic tube. I found that the easiest way to remove a tube is to use a thick book. That makes it much easier to remove the tube. Okay, I think that's enough. So I'll dry clean the tube and wash the case off camera. And we can move on to the main attraction. Okay, let's build one of these. So these boards are absolutely tiny. They're about the size of a DIP-24. And you can use them with two different chips, depending on what chip you're replacing. So either the BQ3285 or the BQ4285. The chip we are replacing is the Dallas 1287. So we're going with the BQ3285. So let's add a splash of solder to one of the pads. And I'll try to align it on camera. Well, it looks okay from here, but I better check. Well, that's odd. This chip has bent legs. That's a brand new chip. How is that possible? I took it out of the package myself. Let me check the other chips. Now this one is good. So we'll use that chip instead. And I can fix this chip later. That's a bit odd. Why does the chip have bent legs when it's brand new? That's a first. Now this chip too has slightly bent legs. Not sure if the camera will pick this up. But a couple of these legs here are bent. Well, that's an easy fix. So let's use this chip anyways. So next I'll solder one of the legs on the other side of the chip. Yeah, not a big problem for me. But imagine getting these chips in production. So I'll just solder all four corners before I drag solder. So these are new boards, new components. So you could get away without using Flux. Although I never had good results drag soldering without Flux. So then I would have to use the fine tip and just solder one leg at a time. But this method is so much easier and quicker. Well, I'll check, but I think that went quite well. Yeah, perfect result on the first attempt. I better clean this up right away, not to make a bloody mess. So there are only two components on these boards, and the other components are one of these absolutely tiny crystals. I will put a link below to where you can find this project. These legs are slightly too long. So let's chop them off. Some more flux. And a tiny crystal. So if you don't mind tiny components, this is a really easy project. And way better than finding a used chip on eBay. So let's clean this up and inspect. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I think we're okay. Next up we need some pin headers. And some of the legs need to be disconnected from the board. Instead of cutting those pins off, I'm going to skip them. Because if we cut them off, we also need to file them down. And I think this way is quicker and easier. I'm just going to solder each corner for now. because there's barely enough room for the battery holder. And if I get too much solder on these pins, the battery holder won't fit. So let's solder the battery holder first, and then take care of the pins. This is a really neat project. You can hack the old battery if you're on a budget, and just add a regular battery on top of the Dallas chip. But this is way more stylish. These boards were designed by a fellow YouTuber, Necroware. If you like the content of my channel, you should check out his channel too. I think I managed to solder those pins without melting the battery holder. Yeah, these pins here, they sit flush against the battery holder. So soldering these pins last was probably a good decision. That was the last pin. So a bit more cleaning. And then we're done. And there's even a place in the silk screen to mark what chip it is. That's a nice touch. Well, I was about to put a battery in, but I realized I forgot to order. So I'll be doing some shopping before we end this video. Okay, the 8515 has been cleaned and washed and left to dry. But let's continue while it dries. So next up we seem to have a problem with the mouse. Microsoft mouse not found. That's really odd, because I'm using the original mouse that would have been shipped with this machine. So something is wrong here. Well, this is kind of odd. The PS2 connector just doesn't quite fit. This is really weird. This mouse is made for this machine. I think I found a fault. Something isn't properly aligned here. So there isn't room enough for the PS2 connector. Well, in that case, that's entirely my fault, because I have restored this machine. Let's get this cover off and see what's going on here. Well, that was easier said than done. So I had to remove the power supply to get access to these clips here. And they are easily undone with a bolt head screwdriver and a soft prying tool. Yeah, I can clearly see my mistake here. So this bracket here is not in position. There is a hole here for this tab, but the tab is sitting on top. So apparently I was in a hurry putting this piece back on. So let's fix this. I think it should be more to the left. Yeah, that did the trick. Yeah, it kind of bounces back up again. So I'm gonna have to hold it down while I tighten the screws. Okay, let's try again. Yeah, now it fits. It's a really tight fit, so there's really no room for errors. Okay, the PCB for the display has dried and it's now ready to put back in the case. PS2 cases generally don't yellow, but this power switch here looked like a piece of cheese. So I took care of it with some peroxide. So all we need to do now is to solder it back on. Okay, let's put the clean tube back in. Before I put the PCB back in, I always check for gaps. And sure enough, there's a large gap in this corner. So that means we need to loosen up these screws and adjust the tube before we tighten these screws again. Now we can put the PCB back in. And we need to reconnect a few connectors before we put the PCB all the way in, because some of these connectors are going to be hard to reach. It's always very useful to take pictures of all the connectors, because sometimes they're not coded, like in this case. But luckily I have a picture and know which connector goes where. I noticed something really odd when I washed this display. The soapy water got discolored with a yellow color. So I have never seen yellow soot. So I wonder what's going on here. I'm going to put the stand back on, but not the lid, because we may have to do some adjustments. In fact, it's quite likely that we will. Okay, let's take care of the hard drive next. So we've got this large plastic IC holder to take into consideration. So I'm not going to use the Rework station. Well, that ended up on the wrong pad. And then I'm just going to heat both sides. And hopefully it will come off, and it did. Love this stuff. Really useful for weird places like this. So this cap here is a 4716. And this one too. And this cap here is 100 micro 6 volts. So this is basically solder that has a very low melting point. So it just stays melted for a longer time than regular solder. And it's made for removing components in places where you can't use a rework station. And it's very important to clean this stuff off, because we don't want to mix this stuff in with a regular solder. But it's very easy to clean up with some wick. And I better watch that edge connector. We don't want to get any solder on it, because that will result in a bad connection. Better clean this mess up while it's easy to access. So, bad cap from 1990. I'm glad we caught it, because these hard drives are not easy to find. If I remember correctly, these drives were also used in the console. I don't remember which one. Okay, that's clean enough. 100 micro, 10 volts. That's close enough. Splash of flux. I usually add solder to one of the pads first, but I want to try a different method today. So instead I'm going to use flux and add some solder to the tip. So let's try this. And then solder the other side. I think this pad is good already, but let's add some. I guess I better check. Well, I guess my other method was easy enough. But this method is slightly easier still. But it does require a bit more cleaning, of course. So these drives are pretty reliable. But I guess you better check those caps. So not sure if it was worth the extra cleaning. But I guess both methods are good. Okay, let's do an inspection. Yeah, that looks good. I'd say we're done here. Okay, let's get that hard drive back in the machine. And it goes in through the front. IBM plastics tend to age quite well, but I'm using some grease on plastic tabs anyways. I got a question what grease I use. And I use PTFE white grease, because it's kind on plastics. And now we can pop the cover back on. Okay, let's start by testing the display, the mouse, and the recapped hard drive. Well, we've got high voltage. That's a good start. We've got something on the screen, so it works. And we've got the usual errors. Display looks okay so far. Okay, let's try out the new clock chip. I've been shopping, so it now has a battery installed. And it sits very firmly, even with those missing pins. To set the clock on a PS2, you need a special starter diskette. The image file to make one of these diskettes is kindly provided by the guys at Ardent. And we need to boot from that diskette. Okay, so when we boot from this diskette, we got this nice splash screen. And just by pressing enter a couple of times, we should get rid of one of the errors. And we did. So now it knows it has a good battery, but we still need to set the clock. So that requires a second reboot. Hey, this display actually looks really good. I really like what I see so far. Camera is probably making a bloody mess of this, but the colors are vivid and it's really sharp and bright. Okay, so we need to go down to set features, set date and time. Well, it sure isn't 1987 anymore, And it seems to be year 2000 compliant. And I think we're done. You can do a bunch of tests in here, but this machine works as it should, so we're just going to skip them. And sure enough, the error is gone. And mouse driver installed. It's working. Awesome. So this machine is pretty much fixed now. Apparently we already have DOS 622. Oh, I forgot to check the hard drive, but it seems to be working just fine. Well, I'm not sure what to make of this. I use this Nokia app to adjust the display. But this display doesn't seem to need any adjustments. Well, aside from the unused space. But I have brightness and contrast set to 50%. And I have all the lights on in the studio. And the image still looks good. So, what was that yellow dust inside? I was expecting to crank up the gain. But maybe that brown stuff wasn't soot. Maybe it was something else. And the text too is very sharp. It's a bit hard to see the difference between 3% and 10%. So maybe it needs slightly more brightness. Well, that wasn't much. So it's still almost at 50%. So I guess I'll set it to 50% and then crank up the gain. But it's really not needed. But since it's this good, let's go for perfection. Well, I barely touched it, and now I can already see the difference between these two shades of grey. Well, the pots aren't marked, so while looking for the gain adjustment, I messed a bit with the focus control. So it actually got worse, so let's take care of it. Yeah, that's perfect. And this is in the corners. And this is in the middle of the screen. What an excellent find. And I've kept this gem in storage for years, not knowing how good it is. So what the heck was that brown stuff inside? Okay, but we still need to take care of the width and height, because we have quite a bit of unused space. Okay, here's the width. I'm not gonna go all the way out, because the image tends to get less sharp out on the edges, and the centering looks pretty much perfect. I'm kind of guessing here because the pots aren't marked on this display. Okay, that's pincushion. That's perfect already. And here's the height. Well, that's good enough, but let's drop it down a bit. Oh, here is that pot. This is guesswork. Okay, that's about perfect. Okay, so before I continue recording, I'm gonna go and buy a lottery ticket. Because this is a CRT display from 1987 with a superb image. That being said, don't rush off to eBay and pay stupid money for one of these. You are probably better off with the slightly later PS1 SVGA display. But my very first Wintel PC was an IBM PS2 Model 50, and it had one of these displays. So that's why I'm all hyped up. This display is going to reappear on the channel when we try out the 8514 graphics card. But that's an MCA card, so it won't work on this machine. Now let's try this IBM with the game. That didn't sound good. Sector not found. Reading drive A. Well, that's no good. Let's try another diskette. Okay, let's try this. Okay, this diskette seems to work, so maybe that was a bad diskette. Oh no, that doesn't sound good. No disk in drive. Oh crap, I think we have a faulty drive. Okay, let's pull that drive out and see what might be wrong. Well, I have repaired quite a few PS2 drives, but this drive is slightly different. So I don't think I have been inside one of these. Okay, so this drive looks slightly more modern actually. It's marked YE Data, made in Japan, in presumably week 50 of 1989. The design is completely different compared to the older drives I have worked on before. I did an inspection and I can't see anything obviously wrong. So I think we'll just clean the heads and try again. Well, the drive was working when I restored this IBM a couple of years ago. So hopefully cleaning the heads will help. Okay, that should be enough. Let's try with the starter diskettes. Well, the starter diskette works. So let's do a test. Okay, so let's try to format the diskettes. So I'll install a blank diskette. Format has complete successfully. So let's do a system checkout. Okay, it's running all the tests. So I'll skip ahead here. Okay, it's running the diskette test here. So I have a scratch disk in the drive. Okay, testing diskette drive. Let's see if it will pass. Well, this test isn't telling us what it actually tests. But it's definitely doing something, reading or writing. While doing these tests, I noticed that the graphics at the lower part of the screen are slightly compressed compared to the top of the screen. So I'm gonna have to spend some more time with the adjustments. But I think it passed the diskette drive tests. Okay, it passed all the tests. So let's try with the game again. And we've got the same error again. No disk in drive. Well, I should probably try a third game, just to make sure the diskette isn't bad. Okay, so I'll try to copy all the content on all 4 discs from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. That should be a good test. Okay, first disc went okay. Second disc went okay too. Let's continue with the third disc. Third disc went okay too. So let's try the final disc. Okay, that diskette worked too. So I guess the first 2 diskettes I tried, they were just bad. So I guess I need to make new copies. Well, playing games with the PC speaker, that's no fun. Well, that's an easy fix with this PS2, since it has ISA slots. Well, that doesn't sound too good. Something is wrong here. Okay, apparently I need to repair one of my sound cards and make a few fresh copies of some of my diskettes. Let's try again. Yeah, that's much better. If you're watching this in the future, there will be a link here to a video where we try out that chunky IBM graphics card together with this display and the PS2 Model 50. If you're watching this fresh, hit the bell icon below and set it to all if you want to join me in the next video. And now is a good time to watch the IBM XT overclocking video if you haven't watched it yet, because next week we are going to play around with a new version of the classic PC Sprint. I would like to end this video by saying thank you to my patrons. You guys are great, thank you for your support. Thank you for watching, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll start recording the next video.